current global financial crisis related to transgenerational treason and corruption? And what will it take to restore and regain confidence in the financial system? Jeff Gates, author of Guilt by Association, has the answer to those questions and more. I'm Susan Madaris, and this is The Autograph.
A Vietnam veteran, Jeff Gates is a widely acclaimed author, attorney, investment banker, educator, and consultant to government, corporate, and union leaders worldwide. He served for 7 years as counsel to the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance. He is widely published in the trade, popular, and academic press. His latest book is Guilt by Association: How Deception and Self-Deceit Took America to War. It has been endorsed by former White House officials as timely and persuasive.
Control of the Oval Office is the goal of the criminality chronicled in this account. Those identified are bipartisan in their politics, systemic in the scope and scale of their corruption, and ruthless in the execution of their geopolitical goals. Unlike criminal syndicates identified in the past, this operation has sustained itself over generations through an extremist ideology that organizes its activities across time and distance. 6 decades ago, an enclave of Jewish elites and extremists induced Harry Truman, a Christian Zionist president, to recognize Zionism as a sovereign entity in the Middle East. Rather than operate as a loyal ally, that enclave has proven itself an enemy. The consistency of Israel's behavior since its founding in 1948 confirms how organized crime expanded to global scale behind the facade of a sovereign state. Yeah, guilt by association is an attempt to explain a type of warfare that's maybe not unique to the information age, but it's becoming more perilous. And the idea is very simple. When you're waging what I call field-based warfare in the shared field of consciousness, imagine, for example, where does a consensus reside? A consensus resides in a belief system, something that we all sort of agree in. That's a field, right? That's where that resides. When you're waging war in that field, one of the most powerful weapons you have is the power of association, either to accredit or to discredit. Now, in the case of the United States, we've been discredited by our association with an extremist state in the Middle East known as Israel. Another example, when you saw Colin Powell dispatched to the United Nations to testify on mobile biological weapons laboratories, which we now know was false, it wasn't really Colin Powell that was being dispatched, it was his credibility. So you took the credibility of Colin Powell, you have this false intelligence, and so the bleed over, associating his credibility with his false intelligence, the bleed over, what you saw was credible, when in fact it was not. So it's that sort of level of sophistication. And the danger is in the information age with global media, the ability to deceive at a global scale is really right in front of us, and it's difficult to see.
How has the United States been discredited by the deployment of guilt by association, as you mentioned?
Yeah, I mean, right now we were taken to war based on intelligence that was either flawed, false, fixed, or frankly, outright fabricated. I mean, if you look through that intelligence, all of it was embedded in a belief system. We genuinely believed in the intelligence. We created a consensus around this, Iraqi WMD, ties to Al-Qaeda, meetings in Prague, yellow cake uranium from Niger, mobile biological weapons laboratories. You go down the list, all of them were false, fabricated. All of them traced back to a similar source, a pro-Israeli source. Now, we've gone to war thinking we were, in effect, we were going to war not for the United States, but for our interest, but for a long-term agenda that was announced by the Israelis really quite some time ago. So we've been associated with this, what we call an entangled alliance, a sort of passionate attachment to a foreign state, this special relationship that we have with this so-called state in the Middle East. And so we are now discredited by that association. People now hate the United States. They hate Americans. They think Americans are doing this, and in truth, the typical American is not doing this. We've just been associated with this.
So was this Israel's war?
This is a war put together by people who are what we call Zionists. Some people call them Zionists. What's even more interesting than that, I mean, clearly this modus operandi, the way of operating, is these are people who believe that they have a right to target thought and emotion in order to displace facts in plain sight. And that is not just extremist Israelis, it's also extremist Christians, Zionist Christians. It's a form of extremism that people think sometimes they describe themselves as chosen. You know, we're chosen by God, we have the right to do this, chosen by God of their own choosing, keep in mind. But the notion is that we have the right to displace the facts because we're protecting ourselves in some fashion. Therefore, we have the right to ally ourselves with a superpower, the United States, and deceive the American public to take their military to war for our agenda. Now the question is, whose agenda is this? It's clearly, in part Israeli. It's also in part Zionist Christian. It's sort of embedded in this, web of belief and deception, and that's what we're trying to make transparent with this. This first book is the first release in what we call the Criminal State series. And the criminal state means not only the state of Israel in its current form, but also that criminal state of mind that says people have the right to do that, to deceive people on a really massive scale, to deploy a military to the Middle East to wage a war on false pretenses. What is that? That's what that is.
And this alliance that you talk about has been going on for decades. How has it managed to remain so strong?
Yeah, conspiracies don't hold together. Someone sells their story to the New York Times. Cartels don't hold together. OPEC is real unusual for being as stable as long as it's been. How do you maintain something like this across generations? It has to be embedded in some kind of a shared belief system that can sustain it, and that's how this is sustained. Keep in mind, we had a Zionist Christian president, Harry Truman, who was induced to recognize this enclave, really an extremist enclave. The Joint Chiefs of Staff of the Pentagon described them as fanatics. They said, do not do this. You do not recognize them. George Marshall, his Secretary of State, told Harry Truman, he said, if you recognize this group of fanatics, he said, I will vote against you. And he did vote against Harry Truman and wrote a memo to that effect. The Joint Chiefs said, if you recognize these fanatics, they have an agenda for hegemony, dominion in the Middle East. So this predates the founding of the State of Israel by a considerable number of years. It's really people who consider themselves to be above others. They have sort of a mandate from a God of their own choosing to consider themselves chosen to do what's been done. It manifests in the form of the state that we call Israel, but it's also got a lot of support in the United States from Zionist Christians and others who have this notion that, that's in this biblical sort of storyline, and they're for themselves this deception in real time when it shows up in the news, for example. That's what guilt by association is about, giving people the tools to see this for themselves.